All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Ultima 8, Pagan. Uh, the intro to this one is also very short and sweet, so we'll just take a quick look at that and we'll see what we've got after that, writing-wise at least. Here we go.
You have been a thorn in my side for far too long, Avatar. Your two worlds will be crushed. Britannia first, then Earth. I shall parade you before their conquered peoples as the fallen idol of a pathetic ideal. I banish you to the world of Pagan. No one here knows of the Avatar.
Okay, so we saw the very short intro here, and it's very short, but it gets the point across pretty well. At the end of Ultima 7 Part 2, the Avatar is grabbed by the Guardian and thrown into this world of Pagan. And well, we get a couple of things in this intro. Basically, the Guardian is directly threatening Earth now, which he hasn't. Well, I mean, I guess I don't know for sure because I haven't gone all the way to the end of Ultima 7 or Ultima Underworld 2, but like he's directly threatening Earth now. He's like, I'm going to take over Britannia and then Earth, and so now there's even more motivation for the player to want to stop the Guardian and take him out. Another thing that's worth noting, I think, is just that oof when the Avatar hits the water is pretty pretty extreme. But here's the thing: normally dropping someone into the water from from a survivable height is not that big of a deal. But in the world of Pagan, that's actually not true. The world of Pagan is basically one giant island surrounded by a big ocean, at least as far as you know in the game. And the ocean is commanded or not commanded, but is presided over by the Lurker, Hydros, the Titan of Water, and she's very unfriendly to the people that get trapped under her waters, which you find out early on in the story. So, this game is continuing on with the theme that it introduced in Ultima 7 Part 2, the Serpent Isle, right? The theme of new worlds that don't know the Avatar, that don't work under the same rules. Now, the Serpent Isle was kind of a middle ground, right? It wasn't part of Britannia proper, and so they had a different conception of what virtues were. They didn't go along with the 8 virtues system that Lord British introduced. But Pagan is a completely different story. The Serpent Isle was part of Sosaria, and so they have kind of a shared cultural heritage, if that makes sense, right? In Pagan, this is a completely different world with completely different people working under a completely different set of fundamental laws of the universe, basically. The world of Pagan is a world that has been commanded over, has been ruled by the Guardian's forces for a long time. And so we're also getting from a writing perspective, we're also getting a hint of what a world that the Guardian ruled would look like, what Britannia would look like if the Guardian has his way. And it's not a good look. The world of Pagan is dark, it's tyrannical, it's restrictive. People only exist on a very small portion of the world, and the rest of it is taken over by these titans that are ambiguously helpful at best, right? We have when you first get pulled out of the water, you talk with the guy who pulled you out, and he talks about being trapped by the Lurker in the seas and being forced to wander the ocean floor for eternity, instead of being properly interred and fulfilling the pact with Lithos. Lithos is the Earth Titan and handles the behavior of people on the island that is the main landmass in Pagan. So And also there's Mordia, who is the ruler of Tenebrae, of the main city of Pagan, and she is not a particularly nice ruler, as we will see here in an early scene. You observe a couple of things here. Let's take a look at the scene first. So we see a few things here. Number one, we see a world where the ruler has the authority to simply say, go hack off that guy's head. We get a little bit of gore early on. For VGA, it's pretty gory, at least around compared to the rest of the Ultima games. We have someone who's being executed for supposed blasphemy against the Tenebraean royalty, the Tenebraean gods, and it's pretty clear that there hasn't been a overwhelming evidence presented against him. We also have her violating the sacred pact with Lithos, and additionally tormenting the executed by putting his body into the sea with the lurker to be doomed to eternal walking under on the ocean floor. Basically, what this game is trying to do early on is trying to convince you that you don't want Britannia or Earth to end up like this. Tenebrae is the city of eternal twilight. There's no sunlight. There's very little sunlight. Even with the necromancers and the Lithos Pact, people still kind of end up undead sometimes, and so it's also a world that's very, unhospitable, I guess is the way to put it. In this game, one of the things that I think is worth noting before we... Okay, so I don't want to spoil too much of this, especially since, I'm kind of all getting this secondhand by looking up things about how this works. But the basic plot of Pagan is that you need to overthrow the reigning gods of Pagan. So it's a instead of virtues or whatever, it's a old school JRPG style 4 elements thing. You have 4 titans, earth, fire, water, and air. There's a 5th one that is or a 5th force that you end up dealing with at the very end, but I'm going to kind of leave that unanswered for the purposes of not spoiling too much. But the basic idea of this is that the Avatar is stuck on this world, and the only way for him to get off of this world is effectively to subvert the natural order that this world is operating under. And that's a dangerous thing to do because the Avatar operated under these 8 virtues for a long time, right? You're not supposed to destroy innocent people. That's definitely against the 8 virtues. And yet in this game, in this story, you're kind of going to inevitably do that to a certain degree. Certain people are going to be very unhappy. And some of those people are not necessarily bad people. It's not that the world of Pagan is a universally evil world. It's that there are evil forces that are kind of in charge of it that kind of twist it toward that direction. But there are good people in the world of Pagan that you're going to end up messing up their lives and their livelihoods to a pretty significant degree by destroying the 4 gods that protect their world. And worse than that, there's also going to be kind of an extensive amount of trickery needed, because part of subverting the four titans is going to be learning how to use their powers, how to understand their particular school of magic. And so, for instance, early on in the game, you go to the necromancers and you're going to go learn necromancy from the necromancers, which also has its own moral quandaries, but not in Pagan. In Pagan, necromancy is a perfectly normal thing, right? But at the same time, you go up to the necromancer and you're like, "Oh, teach me necromancy," and you get quests to, learn different things, learn different spells, understand the kind of the system of magic that necromancy is in the world of Pagan. But you never really tell them, "Hey, by the way, I'm going to go destroy Lithos with this information." And if you did, probably the necromancers would not help you, because you'd be subverting the natural order of their world, the system that they believe keeps them safe and relatively safe and relatively prosperous. And this is going to happen with a bunch of stuff too. You're going to eventually result in the downfall of Mordia, the ruler of Tenebrae, and the installment of a better ruler. But you're still going to destroy Hydros, and that's going to mess with his ability to kind of keep the bad people in Pagan under wraps. There's a lot of bad that's going to happen from what the Avatar is doing in the story. That's a very different situation from one that we've been placed in for a long time in this series. And it's also saying, but at the same time, it's also saying this world does not. It's saying that this world does not exist under the same rules that Britannia or even Sosaria worked under. This is a much more dangerous, dark world, and there's not much you can do about that. And there's much more at risk than simply this one island's worth of people. And so you're doing kind of this, semi-utilitarian thing, trying to get back to some place where you can, protect the worlds that you care about from the Guardian. One thing that is interesting in this game, Ultima 7 did it to a small degree, but in this game there's actually a ton of books laying around that you can read to give you more depth and lore in the story. In a game, again, we've learned from Ultima 5 that you don't just want to do exposition dumps. And so all of the exposition in this game is in a couple of different forms. Number one, conversations. And those conversations are actually pretty, what's the word? They're open-ended in the way that you can kind of say goodbye and come back later if you want to ask more questions. But you're never forced to listen to a long lecture if you don't really feel like it. Even in the very beginning, when you're talking to Devin at the very beginning, he's telling you about the Lurker and Lithos and stuff, the goodbye option is always there. And you can always talk to him later if you feel like skipping the exposition for now, or if you feel you've had enough of it, because you don't need all of it necessarily. But another way to add more depth to a game world is to give, and to make it optional, to make it up to the player to determine how much they immerse themselves into the world, is just the introduction of optional books. The Elder Scrolls did a pretty good job of this. There were a bunch of books in Daggerfall where you could read these books and they would tell you history, stories, myths, theology about the world, and it was all kind of like, oh, well, you can get into this if you want, but if you just want to go hack and slash things, you can of course do that too. In Ultima 8, there's a bunch of books laying around that tell you about the world, about the history of the world, about major characters in that world's history, about the rules of the world and how it operates, things like that. Making these things optional but available is a great way to add to the depth of the story to anyone who's interested, while not forcing anyone who's not interested to actually engage with the extra story bits that they don't actually need. So from a writing perspective, what are we seeing here from Ultima 8? We're seeing, again, a very short intro. We're seeing, however, that intro now draws the player in even further. Instead of just the world of Britannia being in danger, the world of Earth is in danger too. We see a new world that operates on different rules, and this gives us two things to note. Number one, that the rules of Avatarhood don't really apply anymore. Now, we're going to have to disobey them to a certain degree. And number two, it gives us a hint of what the Earth would be like, or what Britannia would be like, if the Guardian has his way. Then we have exposition done in ways that are optional to the player, where the player only has to get into them as much as he wants to or needs to. there's a certain amount of information the player needs to finish the game, but there's a lot of, okay, I opt out from here on kind of things. Another thing that we're going to see that I didn't mention up until now is that whereas in Ultima 6 and 7 and so on, very few of the NPCs were like cookie cutter dummy NPCs, I guess you would call them, right? There were the guards in Ultima 6 and 7 that were kind of cookie cutter characters that didn't really have any information about them, didn't have any backstories, didn't really answer any significant questions. But in general, those worlds were filled with unique NPCs, all of whom had at least a couple of lines of something to say, their name, their job, and maybe one other thing at bare minimum. And there weren't like a whole lot of characters that were just kind of like nobody. In Ultima 8 Pagan, we also observe for the first time a significant number of kind of randomly generated dummy NPCs. I'll show some pictures of it here while I talk about it, but basically we have cases of the guards in Tenebrae. But sometimes those guards will, harass generic peasant people who haven't paid their taxes. And then sometimes you'll go into like the library, or you'll even go like into a house, and you'll find someone reading a book, and trying to talk to them just gets them to say like shh, right? Which adds more characters to the world while putting less of a burden onto the writer. And the artist too, because in Ultima 8, unlike the other Ultima games, there's a lot of attention paid to like character sprites and animation. In Ultima 7, even Ultima 7 Part 2, which was a little bit better looking and had those kind of nice big portraits, right? In Ultima 8, the overworld sprites are all, kind of carefully drawn, and they have a lot more frames of animation. In Ultima 7, there was like 4 per direction, or maybe even just, it was like 4 frames per direction of movement. And there were 4 directions to move, so that's 16 frames of animation. In this game, we actually see not just the avatar, but the other characters in the city have the ability to walk, to creep, to run in 8 different directions. And each of these animations are actually a few frames per like step. And so there's a lot more work that the artists had to do in order to make these characters feel like they fit in with the world, or make things kind of work properly. And so you kind of don't want to have to draw, all those frames of animation for 200 different characters. That would be a little crazy. While at the same time, you don't want to just make a bunch of, characters that have the same faces. So what they do is they made a few characters that are faceless. They're dummy NPCs. You can't talk to them. You can't get any real interaction with them. They can look the same as each other. But in general, the other characters that are actually important to the story, those ones all have unique appearances. They have their own animations as they walk around their houses or whatever areas they happen to walk around. The enemies have a lot more animations because they have to be animated walking and attacking and things like that. There's a lot more work done in Ultima 8 Pagan to make it look like something to make it look real, not realistic, but like, maybe realistic is the word I want, to make it look realistic as opposed to like, a 4-frame walking animation at 5 frames per second. It's a big jump up in visual fidelity. Another thing that they did in Ultima 8, which I think is really good for atmosphere, is they were careful to produce like atmospheric background music, as opposed to Ultima 7, right? Every once in a while it will blare a music at you. There will be, Rule Britannia or some Stones. Stones is kind of the least offensive one of those, in the sense, offensive is the wrong word, but the least annoying of those, I guess, is the way I would put it. Because like you can be walking around and all of a sudden it just blares Rule Britannia and you're like, right? That can be pretty loud. In this game, they actually did a really good job of making these background musics persistent, right? So they have to loop now, but also kind of quiet so they fade into the background. And so it's kind of a step up in audio fidelity as well, where instead of having an occasional blah of background music at you, there's always something little in the background going on, which is just something to kind of keep your ears attentive. And this is, of course, something that you could do before, or something that was important before voiceover became common in games, because you wanted people to kind of have something to keep them into the game while they're playing, as opposed to having to, background music becomes a little less interesting or a little less important when there's people talking constantly, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. The combat in Ultima 8 is slow compared to Ultima 7, where things were kind of like random and you didn't really know what was going on most of the time, and like suddenly you would just die and you wouldn't know exactly why. The combat in Ultima 8 is much simpler, and also much slower. And so, you basically can, and because of the additional animations that exist in the game, you can kind of tactically move around and you can hit things. It's a step up in player control over combat. It's a step closer to feeling like you're actually doing something, as opposed to like, okay, it's a fight, and then blah, and then, okay, we survived. Another element of Ultima 8 that I just want to talk about that's not necessarily related to the writing is the extensive number of traps and dangers in this game. Ultima 4, 5, 6, 7, they had occasional traps. They had occasional, difficulties and challenges, but Ultima 8 is actually really difficult in a significant way. With the addition of more animations, you have things like jumping puzzles, which there are some good sides and bad sides to that, of course, but you also have like a lot more fluid movement. You have a lot more like trick floors, trick walls, traps where you'll explode, chests that just explode and you're just done for kind of thing. There's a lot more of that in this game, which makes Ultima 8 Pagan actually a pretty difficult game. I played it a lot, but I never really got much further than the necromancers in the game because, gosh darn, those necromancer dungeons are tough. Another thing about this game is that the increased visual fidelity makes it so that there's still a lot of clutter. There'll be things laying on the ground, things on tables, things on desks. But since everything is kind of on a larger scale on the screen, things don't feel as cluttered. They feel higher fidelity than elsewhere. So the world still has a lot of the details, but it feels less cluttered than an Ultima 7 might, because things are kind of arranged in a more careful, less kind of grid-based way, and the things take up like a fork takes up a more appropriate number of pixels compared to a table than in Ultima 7, for instance. So yeah, that's kind of my spiel on Ultima 8 Pagan. This is another one of those Ultima games that I never managed to finish. This one, not because I didn't, it still was I was a little kid and didn't have the attention span for it, but this one's actually genuinely difficult. I found myself getting lost in the Necromancer dungeon a lot and getting frustrated there. That's about as far as I ever got in that game. But just final summary, we see a lot of writing techniques to kind of still bring the reader in. We see a lot of writing techniques to make it so that the artists have less work to do. That is the addition of dummy NPCs. We see a darker world with different rules and how the Avatar has to grapple with those rules being an important element of the story. And then we see a lot of gameplay improvements as well. So, despite the fact that Ultima 8 was kind of like it was late and over budget kind of thing, kind of rushed out the door kind of thing, from what I understand at least. The visual and control fidelities of the game are much improved over 7. At least in the sense of like fluidness. So, anyway, Ultima 8, interesting writing, very different writing from the earlier Ultima games, because we're dealing with a completely different world, and we're dealing with a world that is ruled over by the evil force that we're trying to stop. It gives us an idea of what we're trying to stop, what we're trying to prevent from happening to people and places that we care about. And, unfortunately, we're kind of forced to not care so much about the people in this world, which is an interesting move for the Avatar to experience. So yeah, that's what I got for today. Tomorrow, I think I'm going to have something on, not a book review, but it's going to be a little bit of a book-like breakdown of the Chinese classic, frequently called the Water Margin story, or All Men Are Brothers is another title that it has had. It's had a few titles over the years, but I think that's what I'm going to do tomorrow. It's not going to be a review because I haven't read the whole thing in a very long time, but it's going to be kind of a look at a couple of different translations, or at least the availability of a couple of different translations. The one that I'm most familiar with, the shortcomings in that one, and some additional kind of historical background about that book, which is it's a good book, but it's also a very weird book, and I'm going to get into that as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy that, and I'll see you tomorrow with that. Or it might be Friday, but we'll see. Anyway, have a good day, and see you later.